in one of his books, he surveys some 4 or 5 centuries of family law in Egypt, in the late medieval period, and effectively argues that usul al-fiqh, going back to the sources, was simply not something that the jurists did at all. Law had effectively become much closely wedded to local custom and local interpretations that often very clearly opposed scriptural commands. And of course, you may be familiar with Behnam Sadeghi's work of the logic of Islamic law, who argues that even earlier on in certain traditions, say he uses the example of the Hanafi tradition, that the Hanafis did not turn to scripture even when the legal interpretation within the school was deeply challenged, such as whether women could, come to the masjid to pray. When that is challenged, they look to internal rules within the law, rather than within the legal school, rather than going back to the hadith, for example. And the point there is that your centering of the Quran, and presumably the Sunnah as well, is something that a Maqāṣidi jurist might argue that we ought to do that in order to bring the law back from what it had become in the late medieval period. For your legal pluralism argument, I think that you correctly argue that many of the schools, Al-Ghazali, Asharism, had taken this position of multiple plural right answers, the Musawwiba position, but the early jurists, the Hanafis, and many others remain Mukhatti'a, which is not, I don't think that it modifies your argument, but it might enrich it, in fact, to acknowledge that fact. Finally, I find, I guess this goes back to my second thought, the absence of colonialism and resistance and Western imperialism as a fact, not merely as an aspiration by the reformists, but as an institutional and political and cultural fact in Muslim societies, against which they have to argue for the relevance of Islamic law. I find the absence, I guess, remarkable, and perhaps your argument would benefit by looking more closely at the type of reform, type of argument that Maqāṣidi jurists are making. Somebody like Ibn Ashur, once again, rather than Tariq Ramadan. In other words, Tariq Ramadan, in my view, is very easy to critique. He's not a jurist, and even most Maqāṣidis, some people like Ahmad al-Raysuni, let alone somebody like Ibn Ashur, would find it easy to dismiss this broad, general, philosophical Maqāṣidism. All right, so I'll stop here. I think that again, your paper is stimulating. It adds important considerations, but I'd let you think about some of these considerations that I have raised.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem, for those comments. I think all of those comments are well taken. And I think there's a theme running across all of them, which is, I probably very superficially engage with pre-modern views of Maqāṣid, and instead tend to overemphasize modernists like Tariq Ramadan. In the process, I think maybe I also need to be a little bit more precise because maybe it's not exactly Islamic law that I'm criticizing, but like modernist legal discourse regarding Islamic law. And so my paper would certainly benefit, you know, from an increased attention to teasing out what exactly were these pre-modern jurists' view of Maqāṣid. And you know, part of the shortcoming here is that this paper originated in a philosophy department course and not in an Islamic studies department course. So it is something, you know, I hope to keep working on. It was a very fun paper to write, but it's certainly, yeah, I think in terms of technical distinctions regarding the pre-modern conceptions of Maqāṣid, there's a lot to add still. Okay, and yeah, I mean, again, your conversation about Hanafi fiqh, that's absolutely correct. Dr. Siddiqui was actually my professor when I was at Stanford as an undergrad. So I took his course on classical Islamic law, and we worked, you know, we read through some of his manuscript for his book before it came out. The absence of colonialism as a fact in reformist discourse is remarkable. That's what you were saying, right? Like the fact that they don't engage with it. Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think, yeah, I think overall, in response to all of your comments, it sounds like I have like a skeleton there for a compelling paper, but I really need to be much more precise about some of the concepts I'm throwing about. And so I don't really have, you know, any sort of pushback on any of your comments. I agree with all of them. You know, laying out the different and very distinctly opposed theories of Maqāṣid, I will definitely try to do. What Islamic law is trying to be preserved, that's something that should be investigated. What Islamic law looked like in the late to medieval period, the paper could certainly benefit from that. And yeah, a further discussion about colonialism. So I really appreciate all of these comments. And I hope to continue working on this and, you know, hopefully share like an updated draft with you at some point before I submit for publication somewhere. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum, for the responses, Mahdi for the response to the response. And if I may add that potentially you could look into pre-modern critiques of de-emphasizing the text in the Zahiri school, which is really interesting. The work of Ibn Hazm in al-Muhalla is worth considering, especially that maybe in terms of a Maqāṣid theory, he wouldn't fit normally in the timeline, but he does have a notion of aghrad and gharad, and has certain verses where he locates the wisdom or the gharad of the text, which he uses on numerous occasions. So if you're, that's why I said why Dawkins, why it's a fascinating theory to bring to the discourse, but potentially there could be an internal discourse or internal theory to critique, which you could develop from the discourse within usul, especially on text and the importance of text in the production of law. Okay, the next.
May I make one last comment before that?
Please, yes.
So I thought about the same thing, that bringing in Dworkin from outside was, again, it seemed like this was sort of a given parameter. That's what you were trying to do almost as an experiment. But I thought what was interesting about it is that it speaks to exactly the kind of anxiety that many modernists and reformists have, is that that's what the West would want, right? And bringing in a Western legal discourse for a very different effect. I thought that made the paper distinctive, right? That was the strength of the paper. But I absolutely agree with Dr. Sharīʿa that starting from there has to be more by saying that, well, that's, I'm just thinking from this angle, but there is a lot that is within the tradition. And I would say not only Ibn Hazm, who may be somewhat of an outlier, but you rightly bring in Ghazali. You could do more of that, and others, including Shātibi. I mean, so I don't see, for example, the notion of inductive reading of istiqra of a Shātibi, which is very central to a Shātibi.
Yeah.
Right. So Shātibi, in fact, is a very strong textualist. Much more so even that somebody like Izzuddin ibn Abdus Salam or Ibn Taymiyyah, both of whom are much more likely to, their textualist, Ibn Abdus Salam in particular, is willing to make a much broader maslaha-based interpretation, reinterpretation of law, which al-Qarafi, his own student, seemed to push back against, and you may be familiar with that in Sherman Jackson's work. But I mean, there is this discussion which is quite well developed in Islamic tradition, and
Thank you very
much.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you. We now move on to our second paper entitled Ibn Taymiyyah, differing with the four madhabs, madhahib due to Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa by Dr. Ahmed Khatir. Dr. Khatir, or Sheikh Dr. Khatir, holds a PhD in Islamic law from Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He has ijazat in various Islamic sciences, including an ijazah to teach and narrate the Hanbali madhab. Dr. Khatir is the founder of Zidni Islamic Institute. He is also a lecturer of Arabic and Islamic studies at different universities. He travels around the United States and the world teaching and giving lectures. Over to you, Dr. Khatir.
Thank you very much. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه واتبع هداه ثم أما بعد. The title of my paper and my lecture today, working title, is Maqāṣid and Orthodoxy, Ibn Taymiyyah differing with the four madhahib due to Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. As was pointed out yesterday in the very beneficial lectures, in recent years there has been a call to interpret the sacred texts of Islam in light of Maqāṣid al-Shari'a alone, or giving precedence to that. And a lot of times the objective behind this is to discredit the the traditional usage of usul al-fiqh and the process through which classical scholars derived rulings. And the claim and the purpose for this is that the claim is that rulings that have been derived via usul al-fiqh are not suitable for the contemporary period, and thus a reevaluation of the texts is necessary for Islam to not come into conflict with modern ideals and morals. This paper, however, wants to offer an example of someone who is able to work within the Maqāṣid paradigm and still stay true to the text and to the usul al-fiqh tradition. And this paper argues that, in fact, the sacred texts and the rulings derived from them via legal theory in and of themselves incorporate Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. They have always gone hand in hand. There is no need to go outside the paradigm of orthodoxy to achieve the divine objectives, Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. And this is where Ibn Taymiyyah comes in. The polymath Ibn Taymiyyah is going to be presented as an example of one who is able to implement Maqāṣid without the need to supersede texts, the principles of legal theory, or even the four Sunni schools of jurisprudence. And this will be shown through the Fatawa of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I hope to exemplify that he's able to stay true to the tradition while making his case for legal positions based on arguments rooted in Maqāṣid. And more specifically, the Fatawa that will be looked at in this paper, because of course he has many Fatawa, and I wanted to look at a unique topic. So I chose the sample size the fatwas, the fatawa of Ibn Taymiyyah, where he goes against the positions of the four Sunni schools in their relied upon positions. And so this is going to lead us now to an outline of the lecture and of the paper. The paper is roughly divided into three sections. The first is a historical look at Islamic law and a attempt to make my argument that Islamic law, which includes legal theory and maqāṣid, the entire legal paradigm, the entire legal system, was present during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the time of the companions, and was passed down from the earliest generations of Islam to these classical Sunni schools. And so I disagree with the arguments that the earlier generations did not delve into usul or did not use usul, or that usul al-fiqh was made up by scholars later on. Rather, usul al-fiqh, which incorporates Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa and the other sciences of Islamic law, existed from the early period. And in my paper, I hope to show with chains of narration, just as we narrate hadiths and we narrate texts, we want to also narrate these positions of usul al-fiqh that existed from the time of the companions. So this is the first third, roughly, of the paper, looking at the intersection of legal theory and maqāṣid and how that existed from the earlier period, from the earliest time of Islam. And the second third will actually look at the actual chains of narration of where the schools came from, the historical development of the four schools leading up to the period of Ibn Taymiyyah, so that we understand the context, from which Ibn Taymiyyah emerged and in which Ibn Taymiyyah is speaking, and the context surrounding Ibn Taymiyyah when he differs with the four schools and how that got him into trouble, even with the state. And finally, once the setting is set, the context is set, the two introductions have been made, then Ibn Taymiyyah will be looked at as a case study for what I call orthodox maqāṣid, looking at Ibn Taymiyyah's principles, Ibn Taymiyyah and how he deals with principles of divine legislation, and looking at some case studies from his fatwa where he differs with the four madhabs. So looking at the first third of the paper, the intersection of legal theory and maqāṣid. So as I mentioned, I argue that maqāṣid and legal theory have gone hand in hand since the beginning of Islam, and that when we look in the books of legal theory, we find that maqāṣid is incorporated in the books of legal theory, that any jurist who studies usul al-fiqh is going to grow up studying maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. And so the science of usul al-fiqh, briefly, deals with four main areas of focus, and of course each of these areas contains various subcategories and issues. Number one, the sources of legislation. Number two, how to derive rulings from these sources. Number three, the rulings that are derived. And number four, who is qualified to derive these rulings. And when discussing the sources of legislation, and when discussing qiyas and the pillars of qiyas, in particular, the pillar of al-'illah, or the effective cause, the books of legal theory mention how to determine the effective cause of the asl, the original case, which, as you all know, is another pillar of qiyas. These methods to derive the illah in the original case are referred to in the books of legal theory as masalik al-illah. And the effective causes can be determined through, number one, texts. And of course, there are various subcategories of this. Number two, consensus. And number three, juristic derivation. This latter category also has various subcategories. The one that we want to take a look at is al-munasaba, or suitability. And this category is directly related to Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. Al-munasaba is the process that involves determining an effective cause found in the asl by establishing that there is a relationship between a characteristic in the asl and the ruling. This characteristic is deemed suitable, thus called al-munasib, if when applying the ruling due to the presence of this characteristic, and this is where Maqāṣid comes in, if when applying the ruling due to the presence of this characteristic achieves the intent of the divine law, namely to bring about benefit or repel harm. And when we look at al-munasib here, al-Munasib is divided into various categories. And when speaking about al-Munasib, Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa comes into play. So the purposes of divine law that are achieved when rulings are applied due to the presence of suitable characteristics can be divided into daruri, haji, tahsini. And each of these three categories of benefits also has a takmili category, as you all know. And the benefits, the divine law came to protect our religion, life, intellect, lineage, wealth, and honor, with this last one being controversial, as was mentioned yesterday. And each of these levels fall under the previous categories. So each of these has levels that falls under the previous categories. So al-Munasib also can be categorized based on if the divine law recognizes it or not. And this is where al-Masālih al-Mursala comes into play. So with that very quick summary, we find that the main topics of Maqāṣid al-Shari'a are found in the books of legal theory. The core issues and rules and principles that an usuli, a fiqh, deals with involves Maqāṣid al-Shari'a, as well as not just in this chapter and this section of Masalik al-Illah, but also in other chapters such as al-Istihsan, Sadd al-Dhara'a, and others. So it is evident that Maqāṣid is part of legal theory. While later scholars now have this kind of semantical discussion, is Maqāṣid a part of legal theory or just a science that is separate but needs to go hand in hand with it? This is semantics, khilaf lafzi. At the end of the day, they cannot be separated from each other one way or another. And this usage of Maqāṣid in legal theory can be traced back to the beginning of Islam. And this knowledge that was found at the beginning of Islam was inherited by classical scholars. For example, this particular issue here of effective causes, we find that Al-Ghazali, for example, says, whoever through induction, istiqra, goes through the analogies of the companions, may Allah be pleased with them, and their juristic reasoning, knows that they did not stipulate for every analogy that the effective cause be known by text or consensus. In other words, they use this third category of heuristic derivation, ijtihad. And this is exactly what we're talking about here when we're talking about al-Munasaba and Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. So this was found amongst the companions, as Ghazali mentions, that they did not just stick to the text, but they involved looking at Maqāṣid al-Shari'a when determining the illah. Al-Juwayni also says, and we know certainly that they did not stop when joining new cases with original cases at effective causes that were established by text with explicit wording. They didn't stop there. Rather, they delved into the issue of Maqāṣid al-Shari'a and the like in the previous categories that we mentioned. And in my paper, in the version that I sent in late, forgive me, but the version that I sent in, I didn't have enough time to mention various examples from various chapters of legal theory where usul was practiced by the Sahaba. But for example, and I plan to do this in the paper, but for example, we have an issue from Umar ibn al-Khattab. So here, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he uses this concept of mafhum al-mukhalafa, or divergent meanings, when he was talking about the verse that speaks about shortening prayers, where the verse mentions that there's no blame upon you that when you travel in the earth, if you fear harm from your enemies, that you shorten your prayers. So Omar, using mafhum al-mukhalafa, he says, now that we don't fear our enemies anymore, would that mean that we do not shorten our prayers anymore? So here, this is the usage of this usuli principle, mafhum al-mukhalafa, by the early companion, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Similarly, we find the companion Uthman ibn Affan using the usuli principle that when you have two general texts that seem to contradict and you are not able to join between them in any way, then the mujtahid must not use any of them until tarjih becomes apparent to him. And this was applied when he was asked about the issue of joining between two sisters via what your right hand possesses. And he says one verse allows it and another verse doesn't allow it. And so he stopped and did not take either one because he didn't have any tarjih. There was no qarina. There was nothing to help him make tarjih. So this is an usuli principle found in the ijtihad of Uthman ibn Affan. Ali, on the other hand, said it was haram. And he said he had a qarina. He did have something to do tarjih with, to pick between the two texts. And that was the usuli principle also, that when it comes to private parts, caution is given precedence, so he did not allow it. So this is an usuli principle as well when it comes to how to do tarjih, as is found in the books of usul al-fiqh. So there are many examples, and I hope to maybe add several pages of this in the paper, but usul al-fiqh did exist from the time of the companions, which includes them using maslaha, istihsan, sadd al-dhara'i', and munasaba, and all the areas of usul al-fiqh that dealt with Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. So that is the first third of the paper, establishing the relationship between usul al-fiqh and Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa, establishing that it existed from the earlier time of the companions. And now the second part is looking at how it was passed down to us until the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. So during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the companions, when an issue came up, they would go directly to him and ask him. And if he was not actually there when an incident took place, they would use their ijtihad based on what they had learned of law and legal methodology from him. And when the Prophet found out, or when they asked him about it later, he would either approve or correct. And these are several examples I mentioned in the paper where the Prophet, peace be upon him, either approved or corrected the ijtihad of the companions. Now, after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there no longer was a prophet to go back to for approval or correction, and the people now turned to the companions for fatwas. And here, we find that not all of the companions were at the same level when it came to legal knowledge. The companions spread out, in the land. They settled in various areas. They began to teach what they got from the Prophet, peace be upon him, but they were not all at the same level in terms of what they learned regarding law. Different companions specialize in different areas. Ibn Hazm mentions that about 130 companions have been reported to give fatwa. This is a small number compared to the large number of companions that were there at the time, at the end of the Prophet's life. And so only 130 were reported to have given fatwas. Not only that, but not all of the 130 were the same. Most of them were only reported to give a few fatwa. 20 of them were reported to give a moderate amount of fatwa, and only 7 of them were known to give a large amount of fatwas. Now, from these 7, we have 3 main schools of law emerging, or what you can call 3 madhabs starting to emerge. So this concept of madhabs and legal schools and legal methodologies existed from the time of the companions. So from these 7, 3 schools of law start to emerge. And these were the schools of Ibn Abbas in Mecca, the school of Ibn Mas'ud in Kufa, of course Ali ibn Abi Talib was there as well, and the school of Zayd ibn Thabit and Ibn Umar was there as well in Medina. So these were the first madhabs or schools to emerge. Now, Ali ibn al-Madini, the great hadith scholar, he specifically mentions that madhabs existed at the time of the companions, and that their knowledge of fatwa and legal methodology was passed down. So here, he explicitly mentions that the usul, the methodology of law of these companions, was passed down to the 4 madhabs. So he says, Ali ibn al-Madini, he says, there was not amongst the companions of the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, who had companionship, i.e. they followed his madhab, gave fatwa with his fatwa, and followed his methodology, except for 3. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Abdullah ibn Abbas. So notice here how Ali ibn Madini includes legal methodology, usul al-fiqh, when discussing the knowledge of law that was passed down from the time of the companions. And this is not just mentioned by Ali ibn Madini in his book Al-Ilal, but also mentioned by Ibn al-Qayyim in his I'lam. So here, these scholars in those texts not only mention that the knowledge of usul al-fiqh is passed down from the time of the companions as well, not just fatwa, not just rulings that was passed down, which is, the books of fiqh, but also the legal methodology from which those rulings came from, as explicitly mentioned by Ibn al-Madini, who, by the way, is a hadith scholar. No one can say that he's trying to prove madhabs because he has ta'assub towards madhab. He's a madhabi, scholar who has ta'assub towards the madhab. No, he's a scholar of hadith first and foremost. He's just reporting what he has come across through chains of narration. And law has been passed down through change of narration just like hadiths have and the Quran has. So here, Ibn Ali al-Madini in his book Al-Ilal brings the chains, as well as Ibn al-Qayyim. And first of all, I'm very bad when it comes to slides, so this is the best I can do in terms of presenting this with technology. And I wasn't able to mention all the names and the different chains, but this is a general idea of what was presented by Ali al-Madini in Al-Ilal, where he mentions again that from those 7 that Ibn Hazm mentioned were the prominent jurists amongst the companions, and from which 3 main madhabs start to emerge in Medina, Mecca, and Kufa. He mentions, the school of Medina, Mecca, and Kufa, and now the chains of narration and how they reach Malik, Shafi'i, Ahmad, and Abu Hanifa. And these chains actually intersect. And I had no idea how to make these intersect on PowerPoint. This is as best as I could do. But in the paper, you can read, typing it out is easier. So you can read how they intersect, inshallah, in the paper. But the point is that this law that Ibn Madini says is passed down includes legal theory, and it is proven, documented through chains of narration to reach the 4 madhabs. And the books of Usul al-Fiqh and other books of law from the different sciences that were developed to make these 4 madhabs into complete legal systems, they quote their narrations from their imams and the companions in usul. So just as, they'll say this is a riwayah from Imam Ahmad on this issue in fiqh, they will say these are the riwayat from Imam Ahmad in usul. So the narrations from the imams in usul were passed down just like their opinions in fiqh, jurisprudence, were passed down. And those are quoted back to the companions, as can be found in the books of legal theory. Now, what I didn't include in the paper, which I may do, are now once these rules of usul, the usul knowledge of usul fiqh is passed down to these different madhabs, and of course different madhabs, just like they differ on which legal opinions to choose, they differ on which hadiths to choose. Muhaddithin will choose, pick one hadith, another muhaddith will pick another hadith. It's also natural to occur in usul fiqh. So in usul fiqh, the different schools will have differing opinions based on what they received in their chains of narrations from their imams and from the companions the school of the companions they came out of. And so these differences in usul al-fiqh lead to differences in ruling. And here I summarize as many as I could fit in one slide, but there are of course many more, the reasons for legal difference and due to usul al-fiqh. And amongst them is the issue of looking at the usul of the Sharia and Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa, and also, but again, they fit within a greater role of usul al-fiqh in terms of why the jurists differ. All of this is traced back from the earlier generations. Now, I mentioned a few case studies for differing usul. I don't think we have the time to go through them. But anyway, now that the second part demonstrates of the paper that usul al-fiqh, along with the rulings of fiqh, were passed down to the 4 madhabs. Now let's talk about the context from which Ibn Taymiyyah emerges. Once these 4 madhabs emerge and begin to develop, the other schools are either absorbed into these schools or they end up dying out. And eventually what ends up happening is that many of the scholars end up closing the door to going outside of the 4 schools. And many scholars even cite consensus on this issue. And in my paper, I quote various scholars on this issue. I don't have the time to go through it now, but I'll just summarize the 2 main reasons why they wanted to close the door and not allow people to go outside the 4 madhabs, which is important to understand, because Ibn Taymiyyah now gets into trouble for going outside the 4 madhabs in the fatwa that we're going to discuss, inshallah. So the first reason why these scholars, after these 4 madhabs are developed, they close the door, is they say that the opinions that are left from the madhabs that died out are isolated opinions. So we don't have the texts from the earlier madhabs that died out. Rather, we have mention of certain opinions, isolated opinions, in the books of al-Khilaf al-Ali, comparative law. And these opinions that are quoted are isolated opinions outside of a complete legal framework, as opposed to the 4 madhabs. We have a complete legal framework. We know the entire context of those opinions. That's not the case with these opinions from the madhabs that died out. So what could happen is that we have an isolated opinion that could appear to be general, but is actually restricted. and we didn't receive the opinion from that scholar that restricted it. Or it could appear to be absolute, right? And we did not receive the narration from that scholar that made it qualified. Or that scholar could have retracted that position, but that retraction never reached us. Or that position could have been given by that scholar in a certain context, and we are not aware of that context. We just have the position. So that position even could have been rejected by many of the scholars of that time, and we might not have been aware of that. So that is the first reason why we find many scholars citing ijma', saying we're closing the door, because these schools were not preserved, and these are just opinions out of context, and we don't have enough sufficient information to act upon them. And again, I quote many scholars in that regard mentioning that. The second reason, main reason why they close the door, is the phenomenon of giving fatwa with strange opinions and those who are not qualified giving fatwas. And this is specifically mentioned by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali. He mentions that from the time of the companions, the scholars differed in legal issues, and some scholars, even from the earlier generations, came up with positions that the rest considered to be deviant positions, even from the time of the Sahaba. And this is when the earlier generations were known for their piety and their qualifications, and still some of them unintentionally erred. So if that's the case back then what about later times? So as time passed, piety and qualification decreased, and so people spoke about religion without knowledge. And Ibn Rajab says, if we were to allow people to give rulings, based on what they think is correct, going outside of the four madhabs, then there would be chaos in the religion, and the permissible would become impermissible, and vice versa. And this will lead to the religion changing. And then he says that Allah specifically sent the four imams to preserve the legal tradition of Islam, just like Bukhari and Muslim and others were sent to preserve the hadith tradition of Islam, and the well-known scholars of Qira'at were sent, by God to preserve the Quranic sciences and the recitation of the Quran. The four imams were sent to preserve the legal tradition, the halal and the haram tradition of Islam. And so Allah sent scholars and then after Allah sent these scholars, these four imams, to preserve the legal tradition, he says Allah also sent scholars, i.e. the students of these imams, to preserve their schools. And so we should now close the door and not allow anyone to go outside of the four. This gives you now the context where Ibn Taymiyyah is in and working from. And so when he does go outside the four schools, he's attacked by many people and even punished by the state. So Ibn Taymiyyah now, and this is supposed to be the crux, I don't know how much time I have left, but this is the crux now and the most important part of the paper. Now looking at Ibn Taymiyyah as an example of a person who engages in orthodox maqāṣid. And in this context now, he still finds it permissible to go outside of the four madhabs. And one of the reasons why he does differ with the four madhabs is Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah and the principles of divine legislation, you find in the Fatawa of Ibn Taymiyyah, oftentimes he makes a statement, the usul of the Sharia, or sometimes he'll say usul al-Shara, the principles of the divine law, how the law works, what it tries to achieve, the intents behind the law. Ibn Taymiyyah calls this the usul of the Sharia. And Ibn Taymiyyah often uses this as a reason for why he believes other opinions are incorrect, that they go against the usul of the Sharia. And the usul of the Sharia here for Ibn Taymiyyah is not just maslaha, but the usul of Sharia is the entire legal package of Islamic law. And he's one of the few later jurists who is considered to be a mujtahid, and so he has this vision of looking at the big picture and being able to do a big picture analysis where he ties the texts, the rulings, legal theory, maqāṣid sharia, legal maxims all together to exemplify that the divine law is one, cohesive, consistent, and is not a legal body that is that contradicts each other, but it all comes together. You can't have a part of it and leave off another part. If you want to talk about maqāṣid, you have to have the text, and if you want to have the text, then you have to talk about maqāṣid. You cannot leave one, favor one over the other. Rather, it's one big picture analysis according to Ibn Taymiyyah. So you'll find this very prevalent in his writings. He connects rulings from various chapters together to show you how the usul of the Sharia works. Why did the Sharia do this in the chapter of transactions? It's related to what he's talking about here in the chapters of acts of worship. The Sharia is all one and connects, and the intents and the purposes and the function of the Sharia is consistent and the same throughout. And this is his usage of Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. Maqāṣid is not just, well, the general guiding morality, moral principles and maslahah that some people try to invoke and to supersede it. That's not the Maqāṣid Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about, but the Maqāṣid is in the text, and the texts bring about Maqāṣid and maslahah. So here, Ibn Taymiyyah connects rulings from various chapters of Islamic law and demonstrate the underlying intent of the legislation. And after establishing this, he is then able to critique opposing opinions by demonstrating that those opinions do not achieve the goals of the legislator. So for example, when speaking about the position regarding the divorce of someone who is drunk and not being valid, he says, and whoever ponders upon the principles of the divine law and its purposes, in Arabic, the usul of the Sharia and the maqasid of the Sharia, it becomes clear to him that this opinion is the correct one. So he bases that his opinion is correct when he differs with the majority of scholars regarding the divorce of someone who is drunk, because he says that this is in line with the purposes, the usul, the principles, the usul, and the maqasid of the Sharia. So Ibn Taymiyyah's look at usul of the Sharia and the maqasid of Sharia is very textually oriented. So Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, he will not accept this concept of superseding text in the name of maslahah or anything like that. Rather, he will not, from his usul, Ibn Taymiyyah will not reject the hadith due to ijtihad, qiyas, someone claiming that it goes against the Quran, that it goes against the usul of the Sharia. As we will see, he does not believe that a text can go against qiyas or even go against the usul of the Sharia, because they are all one body. That whenever there's a text, that must be in line with correct qiyas. And wherever there's a text and qiyas is a valid text and valid qiyas, that's where the maslahah is. So you can't have one contradict the other. And he critiques scholars that come later that say that we're not going to take this text or hadith because it goes against qiyas, it goes against the usul of the Sharia. He said that's not possible. It's not possible if there's a correct qiyas and an authentic text. That's not possible, as the Sharia is one body and the usul of Sharia are all connected. So he will not accept this notion of rejecting text because it contradicts with another part of the Sharia. When he talks about qiyas, he says, of course, he uses qiyas and valid qiyas, but he says valid qiyas is that which is in agreement with the text. Again, it's all connected, in agreement with the text. He also says, for example, all legislation and texts are there for maslahah. And so all texts and laws in the Sharia are in accordance with qiyas. So he mentions that qiyas, text, maslahah are all in agreement. They cannot go against each other.
Dr. Khatir, may I ask you to try to conclude and wrap up in the next few minutes?
Yes, I'm so sorry.
2 minutes, please. Yes.
Yes,
Thank
I'm so sorry. Similarly, when he talks about maslahah and masalih al-mursala, Ibn Taymiyyah, uses maslahah, but he says he only uses it in accordance with the way the Sharia works, and if it does not go against the text. And he says true maslahah cannot go against the text. He's very clear. And he says every maslahah must have something that points to it from the evidences of the Sharia. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, his look at usul and maqasid is based on the text, and is also based on the understanding of the Sahaba of the text. Here in my paper, I mentioned 2 quotes from Ibn Taymiyyah, where he says, for example, I pondered on this matter as much as Allah willed, and I found that the companions have the most understanding in the ummah and are the most knowledgeable. And he says, I have made clear in that which I have written that what has been reported from the companions on this is the most correct of opinions in judgment and analogy, and is what the book and the sunnah indicate, and is what manifest analogy indicates. And all that which is besides that is contradictory to analogy and goes against the text. And he mentions, in the same quote that, I have not found better opinions on the issues of law than the opinions of the companions. And he says, until this hour of mine, I did not know of an opinion of the companions where they did not differ, except that analogy was with it. And he mentions that the opinions of the companions are the ones that are most in line with the secrets of divine legislation and its purposes, the asrar of the Sharia and its maqasid. And similarly, he mentions, I have not known an authentic hadith except that it is possible to interpret it upon the established principles, the usul, the maqasid. And he says, I pondered upon what I could from the evidences of divine law, and I did not find a valid analogy that contradicts an authentic hadith. So here, I hope I was able to clarify what Ibn Taymiyyah means when he uses maqasid in determining if an opinion is valid or not. It's that which is in line with the text, in line with the understanding of the companions, and that is what brings about maslaha, and that is what the intent of the legislator is. Now, with that being said, looking at it at a practical perspective, I bring about some case studies from Ibn Taymiyyah's Fatawa where he differs with the four madhabs to show how he uses this concept of usul al-Shari'a or Maqāṣid Shari'a to differ with them. And I'll just list these three and I'll be done. In the paper I mentioned the issue of the usage of specific terms in contracts. Ibn Taymiyyah differs with the majority that you have to use specific terms for a marriage contract or a sale contract. Number two, his fatwa on leasing land that has trees that bear fruit with one contract. He differs with the majority of this. His fatwa on a menstruating woman circumambulating around the Kaaba, and many others. But the point is, Ibn Taymiyyah, he uses maqasid, he uses a text, he uses the understanding of Sahaba, he uses qiyas, he uses all of that, but they're all one legal body that altogether form the intent, bring about the intent and the function of the Sharia as was intended by the lawgiver, and giving precedence to one or the other, like some have claimed that we mentioned in the beginning of our talk, would not be in accordance with what the lawgiver wanted. Forgive me for going overboard. Thank
you very much, Dr. Khater. That was a very dense paper, and I apologize for letting the time run over, but I was hoping that we'd be able to get a sense or a taste of your main argument on what Ibn Taymiyyah does. I invite Dr. Uwaimer to give a response. I just want to acknowledge that we received the paper perhaps not in a way that hasn't given us sufficient time to engage with it, but you have presented large parts of it, especially the grounding, and I've really enjoyed it and learned from it. And if I may maybe give one comment before I hand over to Dr. Khater, because of the density and the historical engagement with various texts over time, I did wonder about from a linguistic perspective, the shifts in technical usage of terms such as maqsid across time. My concern would be to anachronistically read the past or read the past uses of the term and concept of maqsid because we identify it in a text in a way that reflects our current concerns, current questions. That's useful so long as we are not imposing the connotations and the current signification of maqsid or a later signification of maqsid on earlier texts, such as the text that you have brought into your presentation and linked with the Sunnah and with the works of the companions. So perhaps you could respond to that. And I have a further comment about the usage of companion views and rulings, but I'll leave it till the end, perhaps to the Q&A or after Dr. Uwaimer finishes his response. Dr. Uwaimer, over to you.
All right. So again, because people have not read it, this is going to be a tough paper to respond to. And in my conversation with Dr. Khater, he had presented the second or third part of the paper to me, which I thought he was going to focus on because I thought that in fact is a very compelling argument that he was making. But if I were to respond to what he did talk about today, I'll be very brief because this will require historical engagement as well as Dr. Sharīʿa pointed out, the problem of intellectual history is not simply to find words that were used by an earlier generation, right? The words may remain constant, but their signification may change.
Yeah.
Even
exactly.
if they mean the same thing, there is a difference between using a word to mean the same thing always versus using a word and many different words to use overlapping things because the terminology has not become stable over time. And it's the stabilization of terminology that intellectual historians have to look at in order to say, this indeed is, this was something, a conception that was broadly shared, and therefore it could be objectified and understood by a large number of people and developed or critiqued. So similarly, the word madhab, as you said, for example, it existed earlier on, but the meaning of the word madhab is different in the first, second, third, fourth century as it is evolving. So for instance, al-Mawardi, for instance, says in the 5th century that a jurist who is being appointed as a qadi could not accept the appointment if it was required that he judge by the same madhab, that he has to be able to make his own ijtihad. This is 5th century. 2 centuries after, historians place the emergence of madhabs already in the, well, 1 century after. So 4th century is where traditionally Western historians would say that madhabs started. I can explain why that is the case, and that it happens in 4th century Baghdad. But in the 6th century, 1 century after that, as-Subki says that now, 1 or century and a half, 2 centuries after that, that it is not permissible, after Baybars, of course, appoints the 4 qadis, 4 madhahib. Now it becomes a requirement that you cannot appoint a qadi except in a particular madhab. So the meaning of what madhab is in Mawardi's time and what it is in as-Subki's time already has very different social and legal repercussions. And so similarly, when we use the word maqsad, the idea that law has intents, right? There's something could be disputed, but most of the jurists granted that. And they were looking for precisely those maqāṣid. They also reflected a kind of skepticism about to what degree we can know the maqāṣid, right? So Hanafis, for example, were much more skeptical about this idea that you can understand the maqāṣid beyond the words, right? So Al-Ghazali's, part of Al-Ghazali's point was not that other people were not recognizing maqāṣid some of the time, but Al-Ghazali was trying to organize in many of the legal opinions and ijtihadat as there is an internal pattern, an internal ordering. And that is what is new with Al-Ghazali. And then with al-Shāṭibī, something else emerges. Well, actually, it's already there in Al-Ghazali, but al-Shāṭibī goes farther in saying that these are the maqāṣid. It's one thing to say that the law has maqāṣid. It's another thing to say with Al-Ghazali that these 5 are the maqāṣid. Like, that's a very big jump from saying, yes, law is purposeful. It is trying to achieve certain goals, to saying, I know what those goals are, and they can be ordered, right? That's what happens with Al-Ghazali. And then with al-Shāṭibī, there is a further differentiation into that these are daruriyat and tahsiniyat and hajiyat and so on. So it is this structuring that is developing. That is maqāṣid theory. It is not the idea that law is purposeful. That's not the theory of maqāṣid that is being critiqued or that is being adopted by modern reformers. So that, again, this is my thought on the part of the paper that you did present, that we should differentiate the, if you will, evolution of how words and terminologies develop and become stabilized, In the same way, to use, I guess, a contemporary example, we could use the word shura, right? I'm using an example that's very different, but just to give you an idea. We could say the Prophet ﷺ used shura, the Sahaba used shura. It's another thing to say that there is democracy in Islam. Right? That's a big jump. And we'll have to say that at some point, to equate shura to a specific institution, and an institution that has a fairly built up structure of how the shura is going to become a political institution, right? That's a jump. And we have to be aware of when that jump happens. So I guess I'm going to stop with that comment. Dr. Sharīʿa, if you have more, please.
I think on the claim that the companions had a fully fledged usul apparatus, I don't know if I got you correctly. I'm familiar with the narratives that try to locate the usul in the practice of the companions, but again, I wonder, to what extent is that a discursive construction, and I don't want to bring into this discussion that terminology because it could, in a way, evoke all kinds of debates about, the theory of construction and all of that. But in a way, let's say these are strategies for legitimation that we see in classical usul, and it may have a kernel of, or it may have roots in reality, or a kernel of truth, in the sense that this is the continuous development of how the past is read in light of the contemporary throughout history. So your claim is too strong, and I feel it is not well substantiated. So that's one comment on the companions. And I'd like to link it to something Dr. Uwaimer said about recognizing the shifts in the theory of Maqāṣid, for example. The shift is theoretical, but it's also methodological in the sense of how the theory of Maqāṣid is being justified and substantiated and produced, what kinds of methodology. So al-Ghazali's approach is different to al-Shātibi's approach, especially that al-Shātibi presents us with the notion that Dr. Uwaimer mentioned earlier, istiqra' kulli. So that's definitely a shift, not just in terms of how the theory is structured, but also the methodology undergirding the production of the theory. And if we claim that the usul can be traced back to the companions, we're not just claiming that they had the concepts, we're also claiming that the concepts were produced using the same kinds of methodologies and strategies to ascribe authority and to legitimate and to develop into methods. So that's another, let's say, historical textual concern. So I think over to you, and you can respond to us. And these questions, let's say, are based on the reception of what you've presented us today, and maybe a full paper would assuage many of these issues. So apologies if we haven't covered everything you have already said in the paper.
Thank you very much for the comments. In terms of the issue of the usage of terms differently in different times, like the term madhab, my intent wasn't to say that the terms meant exactly the same thing, in all times. But for example, when I intended by quoting Ali ibn Madini when saying that there were madhabs at the time of the companions, is to show that the concept of following a scholar's position and giving fatwa with his fatwas and deriving the positions based on his usul did exist in the earlier times. As for other issues that were added on to the concept of madhabs, such as restricting people and hiring people for being, to be judges and so on based on particular madhabs, of course, these are later developments, but the point I was trying to just show is that the concept of taqlid and the concept of following a scholar's opinion and using his fatwa to give fatwa and following his methodology when looking at the text was present at the earlier time. So of course, I wasn't claiming that every term used in different times it could, is used the same way. The term, for something that is, makruh is mentioned even in divine texts to mean differently than as, of course, what later istilahi terms, makruh referred to in later usul books. So this, of course, wasn't my intent that the terms mean the same thing and were used the same way. But the concept of madhabs and the concept of these terms is what I'm arguing existed. And of course, everything develops as time goes, but the basis of it did exist as I see it in earlier time. Now, as for the issue of the principles of usul al-fiqh and arguing that it's hard to make that claim that it existed from the time of the companions, I would disagree, actually. Just because they didn't use the same terms during the time of the companions, they didn't say that this is a general verse that is specified a specific verse, and they didn't talk about issues like, well, after a general verse is specified, is it considered to be qat'i or dhanni, and these usuli issues, they didn't use those terms. But similarly, the linguists of the Arabs didn't say al-fa'al marfu', but it was presented in their speech. Same thing with the ijtihad of the companions. When you look at the fatwa that has been reported to us in various volumes of the fiqh al-sahaba, they specified the general and they qualified the absolute, and you looked at homonyms, and they used all the basic principles of usul al-fiqh was present during that time, even if the terminology wasn't there. But the practical usage was there, just like the practical usage of nahw in the Arabic language was there, even though the terminologies were not codified yet. So when Imam Shafi'i wrote that Risala, he wasn't making it up, but he was codifying what was passed on to him from the earlier generations, from the times of the companions. And I believe that it can be documented. If we look at the books of usul al-fiqh, they document greatly, especially in the greater, encyclopedic works. They report all these positions from the companions on not just the issue of munasaba and qiyas, but and masalih and so on, but in various chapters of usul al-fiqh. Same thing when it comes to maqāṣid and masalih. I know when we're talking about, well, the concept of, just because the issue of benefit and the terms maybe of maslaha or the terms of maybe maqāṣid were used by early generations, it was not used in the same, categorized 5-category sense by later scholars. Well, the way these scholars came to those positions is by looking at the way the Sahaba and the early generations functioned. They saw that when, for example, Ali ibn Abi Talib gave the fatwa regarding craftsmen being liable. Why did he do that? But as to protect wealth. They didn't use the term, this is for hifz al-mal and this is daruri and this is haji, but they used the concept, as I argue, in their fatwa, in their ijtihad. It was in their chest. It wasn't necessarily written down or even verbalized with terminologies, but the concept was there. When we look at many of the fatwa, I'm running out of time, I'm happy to bring examples, but many of the fatwa of the Sahaba was there to protect life, protect religion, protect men. So the reason why these later scholars, I in my opinion, came up with these concepts was because this is through their istiqra of the fatwa of the Sahaba, and the interpretation of the Sahaba of the text, and their dealing with the text, and the early generations, the early imams. These are the categories they ended up coming up with based on how they looked at the text and how they gave fatwa. So I guess the terms weren't necessarily there, and maybe the terms were used but meant differently in technical senses. But the substance, I believe, was there. Not every, of course, issue was there. The Sahaba didn't talk about, khulu al-asr min al-mujtahid. They didn't talk about every single issue, but the core principles of in dealing with the text, I believe, was there from the time of the Sahaba. In terms of Ibn Taymiyyah and looking at the different shifts in usul, so the purpose of my paper wasn't to necessarily trace the different shifts or categorizations of usul fiqh, but was to look at how Ibn Taymiyyah himself used usul in his fatwa and differed, and why he differed with the other madhabs at times using them. And so Ibn Taymiyyah himself claimed that the Maqāṣid and usul al-Sharīʿa is in accordance with the actions and fatwas and understanding of the companions, as I quoted. So the point was to show that this is where Ibn Taymiyyah is coming from, and he believes that the positions that differed from the positions of the companions and the ways of looking at the text that are different than the ways of the companions, then that qiyas is contradictory. That position goes against that maslaha, that benefit, that those Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa, and that's why. And then he uses that as his argument to weaken other positions. So my purpose of bringing that up was to show that this is what Ibn Taymiyyah is using as his argument in talking about Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa and using that to respond to other opinions. So that's why I wanted to tie them together. I think my time is up, but those are generally, I think the main points that you brought up. Thank you very much for your comments, and I definitely will take them and take them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khater. And we now move on to our last but not least paper. I think it's going to be a really important contribution. The title is Before Maqāṣid, Recovering the Contested Vision of Benefit Maslaha in Islamic Law by Dr. Yusuf Sufi. Dr. Yusuf Sufi holds a PhD in Religious Studies at the University of Toronto. He is a research fellow for the Institute of Islamic Studies at the university. At the same university. His training is in classical Islamic law and has published extensively on the history of legal theory, usul al-fiqh, and the historical evolution of substantive law furu'a. Over to you, Dr. Sufi. I'm sorry that we have run late and you had to wait.
No problem. Can I just ask, how much time should I spend on this talk so that we still have enough time for the response and for a constructive discussion as a whole? What would you recommend, Dr. Sharīʿa?
I would recommend that if you can cover your paper within the 20 minutes assigned to you, that would be great. I think we can still have a response from you and from Dr. Daghestani and some time for Q&A.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sounds good. All right, let me pull up my PowerPoint here. Sorry, you can't see my PowerPoint, can you?
No.
Not yet, no.
Right, give me.
You do see the share screen, right?
I do see it. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. I don't think I'll be able to share the PowerPoint.
Do you want to just email it to perhaps to me, and
Okay.
you can try doing that way?
Yeah, we could do that.
Dr. Asim is saying that the participants are not allowed to share screen. Perhaps if IT is here and can allow Dr. Sufi to share his screen? Huda? Okay.
He is a co-host, so he is able to share. He should be able. Aren't you able to see the share screen?
I do see the share screen icon. It's just that when I press on it, it gives me a list of things, including PowerPoint. But then when I click on it, it just says Open System Preferences, and then it doesn't go to anything. I'll send it to Overmere.
Okay.
My apologies. Hey. Ovamir, I'm sending it to you now to the editor email.
Sure.
Okay. Why don't I get started?
Okay.
And you can pull it up when you see fit. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Dr. Sharīʿa. So the paper is called Before Maqāṣid, Uncovering the Vision of Contested Benefits, Masalih, in the Classical Shafi School. I've added the Shafi School since submitting an initial abstract back in January. So the purpose of the talk is to examine the theory of maslaha in the Shafi School in the classical period, focusing specifically on the 10th and 11th centuries. The other purpose is to counter the view that the Shafis are more deferential to text than to considerations of human benefit, and to suggest that at the heart of juristic grappling with the law was a vision where the identification and application of benefit, of masalih, is subject to continual debate or continual contestation. How is this relevant to our discussion on Maqāṣid? The classical model of maslaha that I focus on today with the Shafis differs from the Maqāṣid in two regards. One, it's a model that I would contend was part and parcel of the production of substantive law, of Shafi substantive law, and therefore has deeper roots in the Islamic tradition than the Maqāṣid theory. So for reformers who are concerned with questions of legitimacy within the tradition, I think it offers a little bit, it offers a better pedigree, let's say. But more importantly, the value of the classical model is the value that the classical model gives to contestation and critique undercuts authoritarian claims to knowing the purpose of the law. And I think this is very important because, as we've seen throughout these 4 days, there's a lot of ambiguity around what the Maqāṣid is. Yesterday, we had a talk examining Bin Bay's use of the Maqāṣid for authoritarian purposes. When I use the term authoritarian here, I don't mean political authoritarianism, but just the claims of an individual saying, well, this is what the maqsad is. And there's no discussion about it. So what's the method? The method is to examine the role of maslaha in two texts of legal theory. The first text is the Shirazi's, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi's Sharh al-Lum'a, and the second is al-Juwayni's Burhan fi Usul al-Fiqh. The second part of the method is to examine Shafi's substantive legal debates by examining the case of optional prayers and travel. And though I haven't listed this here, the third part of the method is to examine how contestation was a pervasive feature of the juristic landscape during this period, not just for the Shafis. Though I focus on the Shafi position, I examine how they debated other jurists. And the example that I'm going to look at is the case of the marriage guardian. So what's the maslaha position in the Ash'ari Shafi Usul al-Fiqh? So I'm taking Juwayni as representative of this stream of Shafi Usul. And Juwayni says in his section on qiyas and on identification of the illah, the legal cause for a ruling, that the muhaqqiqun of the past, which I take to be a reference to his Ash'ari school, and in particular Abu Ishaq al-Isfaraini, who is an important Shafi Ash'ari, who had trained with the same usul teacher as al-Baqalani and Ibn Furak in Iraq, but then had settled in Khurasan. and who al-Shirazi, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi says the people of Khurasan took the usul from him, usul al-fiqh from him. He states that the precondition for an illah is its suitability. And what he means by suitability, and this we should likely already know from the works of the likes of Felicitas Opwis, is there a benefit? Is there a maslaha? Another term sometimes used is ikhala, suggestivity of the ruling, or of the illah, pardon me. So Al-Juwayni also says that there is no limits to the amounts of benefits that people can identify through the text. And he says, if you can't find a suitable candidate for an illah, then no analogy is permissible. It's the type of case where you can have a ruling based on the text, but you can't use that base text, that asl, to do an analogy on a different case. This method, he says, is supported by the ijma of the companions, the early generations of Muslims. But Juwayni also adds another really important element to finding the illah, which is that it has to be subject to critique. In particular, it has to be subject to objections and to potential invalidations. So awarid and mubtilat. Another term oftentimes used by the jurists, probably more than awarid, would be i'tiradat. So critique took place in the context of disputations, munadarat, where an illah, among other things, would be tested. It would be subject to objections. Just to give an example, and the jurists, through their texts of usul al-fiqh and through their texts of jadal, give a lot of potential objections to an illah. But to give one example, there's the naqd argument, where a jurist hears the potential illah of an opponent and says, okay, listen, in this other case, we see that the illah is present, but the ruling is not there. The law is not there. And therefore, you have some sort of inconsistency, and therefore you have to abandon your illah. So not any suitable or beneficial illah is the right illah. It has to be subject to critique. Now, when we turn to the Iraqi Shafi branch of Usul al-Fiqh, we see that al-Shirazi does not give much attention to maslaha. Instead, he gives attention to scriptural sources for identifying the illah. So for instance, if a text says this is the law and it adds the preposition li, for such and such reason, then al-Shirazi says, well, that's how you know that that's the illah. Sometimes the word li is not there, but there is, through the construction of the sentence, sufficient context for the jurist to feel comfortable that there is a justification. So for instance, Shirazi says that when the Arabs use an attribute, an adjective, when talking about a ruling applying to someone or something, the adjective is usually the illah, because he says the Arabs wouldn't have other reasons to add this adjective if it's not to indicate that it is the legal cause. Nonetheless, Shirazi does say that there are a lot of ilal which the jurists can immediately recognize as having a purpose. He gives the example of intoxication, which he says it's obvious that this is to prevent bad behavior. The prohibition of intoxication is to prevent bad behavior. It's to ensure the protection of salah. It's to ensure the protection of people's wealth and the protection of people's lives. So to conclude, Shirazi is not opposed to benefit being the basis of the law, but he wants to leave room for cases where an illah is dependent on textuality alone. Before moving on to substantive law, what's the similarity and difference between this classical model and the Maqāṣid model? So both the classical Shafi usul al-fiqh model and the Maqāṣid model, the contemporary Maqāṣid model, by the way, I'm not talking about what al-Ghazali is writing, gives central importance to identifying human benefits. If we go back to Muhammad Hashim Kamali's talk, it somewhat confirms what he was saying, which is that importance to benefit is in the usul al-fiqh, but it's somewhat indirect. Although with Juwayni, it's foregrounded a lot more than with the Shirazi. The big distinction between the two models, in my opinion, at least so far, and I take it that I didn't flesh out any contemporary model, so that might be a criticism of what I'm saying. But the big distinction is the importance that Juwayni gives to critique. And these same types of critiques of the Illah are found in Shirazi's work as well. So let's take an example from Shafi's substantive law and see if the question of benefit or maslaha is there. And I should say before examining the example that the jurists are not using, the Shafi jurists are not using the term maslaha. Rather, they use terms that, like mashaqqa or other terms, but that gesture towards thinking about human benefit. So the 10th and 11th century Shafis affirm that one can abandon the qibla, the prayer direction, in optional prayers while traveling. The Shafis begin their engagement by referencing textuality. So there's one hadith that says Ibn Omar used to do this, saying, "I saw the Prophet do it," meaning abandon the qibla during his optional prayers. But the Shafis still give a reason for why this is the case. They say that there is a need between balancing there's a balancing act between people's need for travel and the continuation of people's piety through performing their optional prayers. What we see is that the application of the law follows a lot less the textual evidence and a lot more Shafi considerations about hardship. So if a person is on a boat or on a very large mount, then there's no hardship in turning to the qibla while traveling. So there's no dispensation there. If on a small mount, however, and in motion, then it would be difficult, it would stop people's travel if they had to face the qibla. And therefore, in that circumstance, they don't need to face the qibla. Same thing if on a small mount while standing still, but in a caravan where the caravan might want to resume travel soon enough, then there's no need to face the qibla. In a case where a worshiper has an obstinate mount, same thing, no need to face the qibla. But if a worshiper is alone, standing still, and with a mount that'll comply with turning, then the worshiper should face the qibla because there's no difficulty there. If walking, then a traveler can abandon the qibla, except when starting prayer, the takbirat al-ihram, except for ruku and sujood. Again, the Shafis say because there's no difficulty in such a situation. Difficulty meaning to turn in those three instances. Now, the Shafis also disagree with Malik based on this notion of hardship, because Malik said it's only valid to abandon the qibla for the optional prayers during long travels. The Shafis say, no, short travels fulfill this purpose as well. And among the Shafis, you even find one figure, Abu Sayyid al-Istakhri, who was a contemporary of Ibn Surayj's in the late 9th, early 10th century, an arrival of his in Baghdad. We find al-Istakhri saying that you can abandon the qibla not only while traveling, but at any time, because the purpose of ensuring that people can go about their business, but also fulfill their acts of worship is fulfilled. Most Shafis disagreed, citing textuality, but also saying it's not really that hard when you're in your home environment in your home city to just face the Qibla. Now, this example here that I gave about the Qibla is a non-controversial example. But in the next example, I want to focus on, we have a case that is controversial in contemporary times. And it's the case of the marriage guardian. And marriage guardianship is controversial because it undercuts women's autonomy in various ways in making marriage choices. What I want to do by examining the case of the marriage guardian is to show that contestation about the benefit of the law is rife throughout the classical period. We're not just contesting questions of textuality, but we're questioning the application of the law or the understanding of those texts, specifically by bringing in considerations of benefit. So I'm going to take a look at what al-Mawardi says in al-Hawi al-Kabir, the different positions that he lists and his different arguments. I'll supplement it with other texts, but I'm focusing on Mawardi here in order to give us a sense of the debates around the marriage guardian. So what are the different positions about the marriage guardian? The Shafi position is that it's an obligation, and there are texts to support the Shafi position, such as there is no marriage without a wali. But the Shafis also give justifications based off of the family's right to honor. So the Shafis worry that if a woman marries a person who is below her in terms of social status, that the family will be subject to dishonor and shame. And so a family has a right to step in and to say, no, this marriage cannot go through. And one of the ways that a family can do that is by ensuring that a woman can only be married by her wali. The Shafis also say that a family has the right to protect their women from a difficult marriage. So sometimes an unsuitable match is not based off of questions of honor or dishonor, but rather are based off of the difficulty that a woman would face in marriage. But the Shafis also debate other aspects that justify the wali. Shirazi, for instance, says that women are of deficient intellect, and therefore, because marriage is a really important issue, they can't be trusted to make decisions in marriage. Al-Juwayni, in contrast, does not promote the idea that women's intellect are deficient and leaves things at the rights of her family. So already between Juwayni and Shirazi, we see that there's a bit of contestation happening. The Hanafi position is that an adult woman can represent herself in marriage because, well, since she is an adult and has reached intellectual maturity, and we can see this by the fact that the jurists allow her to dispose of her wealth, then she's also allowed to represent herself in marriage, be her own wali. But they still, at least some Shafis, still recommend that she have a guardian to avoid social insults about her being rebellious or impudent. Mawardi states that the Maliki position is that a woman of lowly status can represent herself because her family's honor is not at stake. Mawardi answers by saying that there's always somebody that can be lower than someone else, and therefore a family still should represent a woman. The Dhahiri position is that a non-virgin woman can represent herself because she has sufficient experience with men to choose well. So under this view, there's a type of assumption that a virgin woman doesn't have a lot of experience with marital life. A non-virgin woman will, and therefore she can choose more appropriately. Muardi answers by saying that both virgins and non-virgins are not to be trusted with their sexuality, and says that, in fact, perhaps even a non-virgin woman should be given less trust because she would give more importance to her desires in choosing a marriage choice, a marriage partner, than somebody who has not experienced sexuality. So, what resources do these classical debates give to reformers today? It's pretty obvious that if reformers, if contemporary Muslims start to grapple with not textuality, but with the underlying reasons that classical jurists gave for their positions, that the law can very easily be extended. Actually, you could be very faithful to the Shafi position or to other jurists' position. On marriage guardianship, for instance, you could be very faithful, but show that it's applied in very different ways today. So for instance, if Muslims today feel that the arguments around women's deficient intellect doesn't work, or that the arguments around women being misled by their sexual appetites don't work, or that virgins don't have enough experience to make wise choices, then in fact they can very easily say that the position of the wali as an obligation makes very little sense. Likewise, if family honor makes little sense to some Muslim cultures, then again, the need for a wali is undercut for those specific societies. I should mention that there is precedent in the Shafi school for this. The Shafis of Khorasan, in particular, al-Qafal al-Saghir or al-Marwazi, who's oftentimes credited for being the sheikh of the Shafi branch of Khorasan, had the opinion that honor was something that honor in lineage was only something that Arabs cared about, and therefore Persians and other peoples shouldn't give any importance to it in choosing an appropriate marriage partner. Something similar could be applied today. But there is another issue, another problem, and I'll try to wrap up. I only have about a minute needed. There's a problem of power here, because if we ask Muslims today, particularly Muslim women, to engage with jurists of the past, are we accepting that it's tolerable that they use the type of demeaning language, like that women are of deficient intellectual capacities, or that women aren't to be trusted with their sexuality? What sense of injury do we impose upon Muslim women by countenancing that juristic tradition? But even if we were to put aside the arguments of the jurists and to say, you know, it was too marred by misogynistic assumptions, I do think that the classical model that I've identified with the Shafis, but also more broadly, the model of contestation that I've examined when looking at the question of guardianship, might offer something for Muslims today. In particular, there are two conclusions that can be drawn from this model. One, no human has full insight into the purpose of God's law. And two, no position has any worth until others are allowed to critique it. So what conclusions would I like to draw from this? First, Shafi legal theory gives central place to maslaha and its legal interpretations. Second, Shafis derive substantive laws based on the fulfillment of this benefit. Third, Shafis were part of a classical model that focused on contestation over the benefit of the law. And what's the relevance of this to Maqāṣid theorizations? Well, number one, we have a lot of overlap between the Maqāṣid model and the classical model. Both leave open the possibility that there are a multiplicity of benefits that humans must seek out as they engage with textuality. But second, the classical model foregrounds contestation and critical engagement in a way that, from what I know, the Maqāṣid models of the present do not. the classical model also, and this is perhaps paradoxical because the classical model is very hierarchical between lay Muslims and jurists. Nonetheless, I think if you were to extend it today, the classical model makes room for lay Muslims to add their voices to debates about human benefits. And what I have in mind here is the fact that lay Muslims will have more insight. For instance, lay Muslim women will have more insights into the types of arguments about the marriage guardian and its benefits than a lot of jurists would. So that's all I have to present today. That's my paper, and I look forward to the respondent, and I look forward to the engagement from the rest of the panelists and the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sufi, for staying within the limits of time and for presenting another thought-provoking paper, which I hope will garner many questions. I certainly have a few thoughts, especially on the last two slides, as you might have expected. But let me hand over to Dr. Sami Dagestani. Dr. Sami, are you with us?
I'm
yes.
Here. Hi, everyone.
We're looking forward to your response.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sufi, for your presentation and for the paper as well. I read your paper with great interest, and I very much enjoyed the discussion that you focused on. I have a few comments, a few questions that I would like to share with you, and some are rather brief and technical, and others might be more methodological. And I will start with your reference to classical examples being the model, as you say, of contestation over benefits. And this leads me to al-Juwayni and his Burhan. While you suggest that al-Juwayni specifically, and also the Ash'ari stream more in general, resorted to textual sources or textual accuracy, as well as the usage of the intellect when really thinking of and delineating maslaha, I have not come across a clear-cut definition of what indeed constitutes benefit in the Burhan, right? And again, there's a lot of discussion about how it can be used and to what ends, but not what is it to begin with, right? And I'm guessing that the lack of a clear definition is perhaps intentional, in that it allows the term to be rather fluid in its application to the law. So your reading of al-Juwayni suggests that he employs the term as a lens through which one can derive various legal opinions. And you're also cognizant of the wider debate surrounding the term as being a tool or a mechanism or how to interpret the law. And this brings me to the basic question that I'm dealing myself with in more kind of an ethical economic genre. What is beneficial according to Sharia law to begin with under different circumstances, which can also, I think, help explain what then constitutes the very notion of critique that you also focused on. Now, on a side note, given the importance of al-Baqillani's role in constructing usul al-fiqh, I was wondering why not introducing some of his insights into the discussion about scripture and reason in relation to benefit. Does he have to say something on the topics that you're dealing with, or nothing at all, right? Second, on the differences and similarities between al-Juwayni and al-Shirazi, it seems that even though for al-Juwayni benefit has to be a precondition for the very identification of a legal cause, al-Shirazi also pays some attention to benefit by engaging with the scripture and by resorting to intellectual reasoning, right? So my question is, what does al-Shirazi's departure from the more rigid understanding of using reason versus relying on scripture, what does this say about the overlaps between Ash'ari Shafis and Iraqi Shafis, and about the very idea of Shafi being tied to textual sources more broadly in the first place, right? And my final comment is about the case of marriage guardianship, and I think it can be extended also to the case of prayer and the very concept of the need to surpass the scripture in order really to address any particular subject at hand and employ, as you say, the very notion of the critique of maslahah or critique of benefit. So I think you're correct in identifying how the classical model of contestation over the benefit of law allows contemporary Muslims to engage critically with the law of guardianship today, which I think points to both, and this is where the problem probably arises, to cultural relativism, as you mentioned at some point, but also to something called cultural ambiguity. And I use the term ambiguity here as a term that really differs from relativism and differs from ambivalence, right? I attach a positive connotation to ambiguity. So on one hand, this contestation gives, I believe, legitimacy to the classical scholarship, because that body of law on how guardianship has been, has been out there for centuries, right? And one is then invited to look at it and to analyze it. But on the other hand, you claim that engaging with traditional outlook allows for a democratization of critique, to think critically, to think epistemologically about benefit. What are its boundaries? What are its limits? And I think that this link between legitimacy and critique can be explained by the notion of polyvalence or ambiguity or multiplicity, which was, according to some contemporary scholars, really the gist of Islamic culture from the get-go, including in usul al-fiqh and in other domains. So this is to say then that it's not surprising then that varying opinions existed on the same issue and that the same questions generated multiple answers in different disciplines or even within the same discipline, right? Both in legal theory and in substantive law. So in light of this theory of ambiguity, what I'm missing then is perhaps a somewhat clearer link between, or to elaborate on, the classical legal scholarship and how the moderns or contemporary subjects can really take stock in, or if we should at all, according to that philosophy, in those pre-modern deliberations when discussing maslahah. But also on the flip side, if maslahah can in actuality be seen as part of the tradition of usul al-fiqh, and hence part of, if you will, under quotations, more traditional legal discourse, and not as a nuanced mechanism that sometimes modern scholarship is presenting it to be. So these are just some of my comments and reflections on your paper, and I thank you again, and I look forward to listening to your response.
Thank you very much for your engagement. I really find al-Juwayni not giving a list of maslahah as refreshing. And that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight within the paper, is that there is no limits to the maslahah. It's something that the companions, according to Juwayni, the companions did, that they would, whenever they would engage in analogy, whenever they would try to find an illah, that they would refer back to finding a benefit. And what it leaves open is the possibility of humans discovering the benefits of God's law, the innumerable benefits behind God's law. We're not restricted to 5 or 6. We're not restricted to a definition of the past. Really, it's an open field for people to explore. And so I think, I would have wanted to make that even more prominent within the paper. But I think modernist reformers, when they take up Maqāṣid, what's perhaps a little bit ironic is that they resemble more Juwayni's approach to maslahah than they do a listing of five Maqāṣid like Ghazali or like Shatibi does. So that, when you take a look at Kamali's work or Auda's work, or Adis Duderja, they're all talking about how, there's these 5, but we also have scholars telling us that there are other sources, and they might, I think Dr. Kamali had quoted Ibn Taymiyyah saying that there were innumerable maslahats. So they do that move where they root themselves in this idea of 5 or 6 maqāṣid, but at the end of the day, then they say, but actually there could be a ton of maqāṣid. We could have hundreds of them. So in some ways they resemble more Juwayni. So then there isn't much of a critique for me to say, only to say that Juwayni perhaps gives them additional justification. You know, you could go to Ibn Taymiyyah, but you could also go to Juwayni. But I think it's very refreshing. I think it leaves it open to contestation. So I think the two go together. I think it would be problematic if Juwayni tried to give a comprehensive list of maslaha. The point on Baqalani is a really good one, and that's an important part of the history of the Ash'ari Shafi usul, even if Baqalani was a Maliki. And tersely, the answer is just that I need to go back to the sources. I didn't have full time to examine what Baqalani's position on the matter was. So yes, that will be part of a final paper for sure. The overlap between the Ash'ari Shafi usul and the Iraqi Shafi usul. Yeah, the thing is that I'm trying to show that that in large part. So look at it this way: the Shafis from Khorasan, who typically are, if Shirazi is right that they follow al-Isfaraini, they have this challenge of merging the opinions of Shafi usul, starting with the Risala. Juwayni's dad wrote a commentary on the Risala. Starting with Shafi, but also the Iraqi Shafis themselves, that according to the history of the Shafi school, they inherit from that Iraqi branch at first, until al-Qafal al-Marwazi later on. So they have this challenge of reconciling between the positions of the Shafis and this elaboration of usul al-fiqh that's coming out of Ash'ari thought. So on the surface of things, they depart from Ash'arazi and the Iraqi Shafis quite a bit. But at the same time, when you look at their substantive law, it's very similar. And that tells me that they needed to have sufficient overlap for that continuation of commonality between the madhab. Like, we do talk about a Khorasani branch of Shafism and an Iraqi branch of Shafism, but that doesn't go back to Ibn Furak or al-Isfaraini. It goes back to al-Qafal al-Saghir. So it goes back to differences within the science of furu, substantive law, not usul al-fiqh. So there is going to be a lot of overlap between the two. And so maslaha matters for Juwayni, but Juwayni also gives prime importance to textuality in his section on hermeneutics. Likewise, Shirazi gives importance to textuality and finding the illah, but then says, but the jurist, there's certain cases. He even has a section where he says there's certain cases where you don't even need that type of linguistic proof, like prepositions like li. They're just so obvious that any Muslim reading it can see, well, that's the reason why God made this ruling. And perhaps I should include that in the paper. So my aim was to show that there's sufficient overlap between them, that even if we want to be historically accurate and want to identify the differences, but when we're talking about maslaha, I feel confident saying that the Shafi school in general gave importance to it in their substantive legal rulings. The final point about the guardian and the culture of ambiguity. You mentioned that it's not surprising that there should be different legal opinions. And that's a fair point, because, we're, as historians, we're used to seeing pluralism. Like, is it really weird, Yusuf, to find that Mawardi would go through all these different legal opinions? No, it's not strange at all. I guess what mattered to me, and this is from my studies of munadarat and seeing how the jurists always are butting heads in their munadarat, in their disputations on different proofs, and being really adamant in ensuring that their opponents' proofs are as well argued as possible. What I think is relevant in the section on that Mawardi presents are the instances where Mawardi feels impelled to say, well, this is wrong for this reason, this is wrong for that reason. So it's a bit of a challenge just working with texts of furu and not working on transcripts of disputations, which I don't have many of. It's a bit of a challenge to show that dimension of contestation as opposed to just pluralism. But I think, oh, should we? Yeah, so it's a bit challenging, but it's what I'm interested in, is bringing in the critique part beyond just the pluralism.
Yeah, thank you very much for it. Just a very, very brief response. I'm sure that you're familiar with Halak and Shahab Ahmed and other types of work. I'm not sure if you read German, but I think the book is being translated into English by Thomas Bauer, Die Kultur der Ambiguität, eine andere Geschichte des Islams. I think it's going to come out or has come out with Columbia. This might be a welcoming addition, probably for the type of research that you're doing. Thank you again for your response. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Dagestani, and thank you, Dr. Youssef, for the response and counter response. I think there is one hand. It's Dr. Awaimer's hand. I also saw Dr. Basit come in and raise a hand, but I'm not sure if he's still intending to ask a question. So, Dr. Awaimer, please go ahead.
Okay, so I make a couple of quick comments for Youssef. I thought that, of course, your direction of your paper and the distinction between Maslaha and Maqāṣid was fascinating. But I have to say that I was underwhelmed by your evidence. I felt that on the crucial points that you're making, you could have done more, and I'd invite you to do more. So, for example, you mentioned, I thought a really interesting point was that you were reading al-Juwayni almost as, in a Popperian sense, as inviting falsifiability. And there you suggest that the terms al-awarid wal-mubtilat would, as justification for that. But when I read, I thought this is just, when you are thinking as a jurist, you're not inviting critique and falsifiability. It's simply that as you are determining a maslaha, it could be obstructed by your own understanding of other texts or your own understanding of illogicality. And that would be the awarid. And you glossed it as i'tirad, right? Which would be much more clear as an objection. But al-awarid doesn't need to be an i'tirad as in a discursive opposition. So how confident are you in that reading? Similarly, when you're talking, you present the examples that you present of maslaha as part of Shafi'i reasoning, I thought it could be a lot stronger because the examples that you present, they still could track textual evidence, right? So one thing that would be important to show is that, well, there is no textual basis for saying that. They're just talking about this as, they're just reflecting on this. And again, is just reflection on the wisdom of God's law sufficient to argue for a, functional presence of maslaha, especially when the school's founder is so strictly, seen as being against certain use of maslaha. And I understand that I have seen evidence where people strongly argue that Shafi'is did use maslaha and so on. But I think that in some of your examples, I didn't feel that as strongly. And I guess the point also about other texts, for example, al-Mawardi's discussion of the issue seemed like it's a discussion of maslaha, but of course there is a text, hadith, in some cases sahih hadith, to back each of those positions, right? Whether a thayyib could choose her, or marriage partner or not. So in other words, it comes off as a discussion just of maslaha, but there is a lot more that's going on there. I guess I also have a second question for Dr. Ahmed Khater, if he could elaborate on, going back to the third part of his presentation, how he argues that Ibn Taymiyyah, in fact, goes against. I mean, that's one part that did not come out. We didn't get to it in your presentation. It says, how is it that Ibn Taymiyyah opposes the four madhahib? And why do you see a strong, because that's a very strong position to take. Why do you feel that that is a strong indication of this maslahah and maqāṣid? If you could elaborate on that in an answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Is it my turn, or is it still Dr. Yusuf's turn?
I think if Dr. Yusuf can address the question, just to keep to the chronological order of Dr. Awaimir's questions.
Be happy to. So actually, I'm very happy that you raised those critiques of my paper, because there are things that I can recognize as being problematic, and there are also things that I feel I can fairly easily address. Inviting critique, yeah, you're not wrong that I think in texts of Usul al-Fiqh, the jurists of the Shafi school, both Shirazi and Juwaini, are thinking partly about a monologue. They're partly saying, okay, fine, a maslaha, and now and so your illah might be sound, but now you need to subject it to some testing. And I think what proves your point that it can be a monologue is that Shirazi in his Sharh al-Lum'a lists a greater amount of invalidators for an illah than he does in his al-Ma'una fil Jadal, specifically because, and he says, because in the Sharh, in the Ma'una, there's no need to list the things that a jurist would hold himself accountable to, but that an opponent would not. So you're right there. But I can also very easily point to those things in their texts of Jadal, to those examples where they are concerned with an opponent critiquing their illah. I can also very easily point towards their texts of usul, their sections of their texts of Usul al-Fiqh, where they discuss when a disputation becomes important. And a disputation becomes important because, you could go to al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. He says, yeah, after you've done all your studies and you've researched it and you've done your monologue, the disputation is an important mechanism to kind of find confidence in yourself that this is the position that you favor as a mujtahid. And Juwaini and Shirazi also have statements of the like. So I can very easily add that within the article to address that issue. The, 1 second. The second critique, I wrote down some notes, but I don't think I don't remember it exactly, even with the notes I wrote down.
May I just make a very brief comment on the point you were tackling?
Yeah.
I think, I'm more sympathetic to your framing, perhaps. I recognize the critiques of Dr. Awaimir, but I think reading the classical texts across genres, you get a sense that there is a mental interlocutor even in monologues. So even if you're speaking to yourself and wanting to strengthen your argument, or like with al-Ghazali on trying to develop a typology of ilal where the illah can be looked for, and how to prove the illah, the mustanad of the illah, the qara'in, the dalail, etc. It's the mental interlocutor is there in terms of this is the framing of the discourse, so it keeps it open for other interlocutors. It's not stated in a dogmatic absolutist manner. It is how the intellectual discourse is being structured, whether there's an actual interlocutor or not. It really doesn't matter, because it keeps the discourse open for critique. That's just one comment, and it didn't turn out to be very brief, so I apologize for that. Do you want to come back to that?
No, I remember it now.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. So there's this worry that if there's textuality, then in fact the Shafis are just saying, okay, yeah, the real basis of the law are these texts, and we'll follow it to the letter of the law. But then we also just note out of our own curiosity, I guess, that this reflects a wisdom of God's. I don't think in my example of the application of the application of the dispensation of the Qibla, I don't think that makes sense based off textuality, because they are not able to flesh out the rule without keeping into consideration the purpose. That's what makes them say in some instances, no, you have to face the Qibla, despite the fact that we have statements that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do that. And you have instances where they say, no, you don't have to face the Qibla, because that would be tough. That's also the reason why al-Sharīʿa says you can not face the Qibla whenever, even when you're at home. So I think in that case, the wisdom behind the law really matters, at least to the application, maybe not to the foundation of the rule. Now, there is interaction with textuality, because a lot of the Shafis, when they answer al-Sharīʿa, say, listen, the text doesn't give us license to do this at home. But they also add, and in addition, your reasoning isn't so sound, because it's not so tough to face the Qibla when you're at home. So I feel like I don't know what to say about that one, except that maybe I can make more prominent in the argument that application wouldn't make much sense without the Shafis paying attention to maslaha. For the discussion of the guardianship as well. So for that one, you're right. They rely on textuality. The Shafis, they feel very comfortable with their interpretation of textuality. But then once they engage with jurists like a Dhahiri or Malik or the Hanafis, they either, like in the section that I show, they're not dealing with textuality. If they are dealing with textuality, yes, they will make claims about the nature of language and the dhahir meaning of a hadith, etc. So they'll make textual claims. That's part of what they do. But in the section that Marti is tackling, they're very much interested in discussing what's the purpose behind it. And I guess I can bring in the fact that it's not one or the other, that both are happening as I rework the paper. So I really appreciate those critiques, and I think I can address those.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Khater, would you like to tackle the question posed by Dr. Uwaimer?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for asking that question, actually, because subhanAllah, the bulk of the paper is Ibn Taymiyyah and him using Maqāṣid in terms of going against the madhabs. And all that I mentioned in the presentation, I thought I'd get to Ibn Taymiyyah, but it turns out I didn't have enough time. That was all just a precursor and an introduction to, bring us to the time of Ibn Taymiyyah and what was going on with the madhab. So maybe it wasn't clear in the presentation because that took bulk of the time, but the paper itself, actually, the part of Ibn Taymiyyah is much larger than what those introductory parts were, the historical context of Islamic law and usul by the time it gets to Ibn Taymiyyah. And I might just take all of that out if you feel that that would be better. And maybe it'll make the paper too long, so maybe I'll just focus on Ibn Taymiyyah, but I wanted to see the feedback, and sorry if I didn't get to actually Ibn Taymiyyah. So thank you for the question, because that is the whole point of the paper. And the reason why I chose Ibn Taymiyyah is the issue of I wanted to provide an alternative to the notion that to deal with Maqāṣid, you have to supersede the text and supersede the madhab. And I found in Ibn Taymiyyah's work that he was able to invoke Maqāṣid, stay true to Maqāṣid, and still be very true to the text and work within the frameworks of the existing schools and within legal theory. So Ibn Taymiyyah, I've noticed a pattern in his fatwa when he does differ with the madhabs. he says that those opinions go against usul al-Sharia, or at times he will say usul al-Shara. And what does he mean by usul al-Sharia and usul al-Shara? To me, based on his explanation and his arguments for why those opinions go against usul al-Sharia, he means by that the way the lawgiver intended for the law to function. So it's not just necessarily to preserve wealth or to preserve lineage, but how does that occur? How does a Sharia function to reach those benefits? And so in his fatwa, he shows that his positions do reach those benefits by staying true to what the lawgiver truly intended when it comes to these issues, how the lawgiver wanted the rulings to come out, and how the Sharia is supposed to function in these different situations that he's referring to. So he looks at he'll mention number one, the texts that he believes indicate that his position is in accordance with what the lawgiver intends the Sharia, how the lawgiver intends the Sharia to function. Number two, he'll quote the positions of the Sahaba to show that he believes that his position in terms of how the Sharia should function in this situation was the position held by the companions as well. And number three, he will invoke the usul of the four madhabs themselves to show that you, O followers of these madhabs, went against what I believe your madhabs themselves tell you or should be telling you this how the Sharia would have functioned in this case. And then using those three arguments, he then shows that this is why this position is in line with the functioning, the usul, the principles of the Sharia, and why your positions are not. So for example, and each one of these examples takes several pages. The 20 pages will be covered just by these issues. The issue of using specific terms in contracts. So we find in the other madhabs, when it comes to marriage contracts, sales contracts, they're very particular in what type of terms they use, using specific terms, the terms for marriage in Arabic, for example, the terms, certain terms and certain sigha, the offer and acceptance, certain formulas for a transaction to go through. Ibn Taymiyyah, he argues that this is not in line with the principles of the Sharia. Rather, the intent of the lawgiver when it comes to contracts, when it comes to these type of issues, he says it's different than that. Rather, he believes that the intent of the lawgiver, the purpose of the law when it comes to contracts, is that these contracts take place with whatever people customarily believe and act upon to make these contracts take place. There's no particular sigha, there's no particular formula, there are no particular terms that have to take place for contracts to, for a contract to, yanaqid, to take place. So what he will do is, number one, he will look at the text and bring different examples from various chapters of law that show that here the Sharia did not take into consideration terms. Here the Sharia viewed that this position, this contract was valid, this transaction was valid, even though this particular term was not used. And then he will bring positions of the Sahaba, showing that that's what they understood as well. And then he'll bring examples from the four madhabs where in your own madhab, Hanbali or Shafi'i or Maliki, why in this case you guys didn't stipulate that it had to be a particular sigha, but over here you did. And over here you didn't stipulate a certain sigha, and over here you didn't, but here you did. So he is trying to prove that the intent of the lawgiver when it comes to this issue is that customs override. So he says, for example, thus the wisdom behind these issues of not needing a sigha in contracts, that the divine law has taken into consideration in the book, sunnah, and reports is clear. As for stipulating a specific term, then there's no textual or rational evidence. This comprehensive principle that we have mentioned, that contracts are valid with all which indicates their purposes from action and statement, is what the principles of the divine law, the usul of the Sharia, indicate. And this is mentioned over and over, that if you say that the reason why we need a sigha is because only a sigha can truly tell us what if you have consent for this contract, then I will show you that there are many areas where the lawgiver has the law function to approve your intent without actually having to stipulate it with your or invoke it with words, but rather the qarina of the hal of the situation, the context is enough according to the lawgiver. So that is one example where he uses texts, opinions of companions, and the usul of the other madhabs to show that this is what the Sharia intends when it functions when it relates to contracts. Another example is the issue of a woman going to the Hajj, for example, with her Hajj group, and she's only there for a limited time. The Hajj group is going to leave. She's going to be left in a country alone. She's menstruating. She can't do the tawaf, the circumambulation. The other madhabs make it more difficult for her what she has to do. And Ibn Taymiyyah comes and says, when we look at the examples of the functioning of the Sharia in various cases, it becomes clear that the usul of the Sharia on this issue, the principles of Sharia, how the Sharia is supposed to function, what outcomes it's supposed to bring on this issue, is that hardship is supposed to be dropped and she's allowed to make tawaf. So he then follows the same pattern. He brings a text of how certain similar cases of hardship were dropped by the Sharia. He shows that this is the understanding of the companions. And number 3, again, he shows that even within your own madhabs, why did you make it that the hardship or the scenario is not dropped here, the obligation is not dropped here, whereas in other cases, your usul indicate that it would be dropped for other issues, so you should also apply it here. And same thing with many the other examples, selling that which doesn't, and ma'dum, that which doesn't exist, and so on and so forth. So I hope I kind of brought more light to what I meant by that. So it's not necessarily just saying that this is Ibn Taymiyyah arguing this is preservation of wealth or preservation of lineage, but it's Ibn Taymiyyah showing that these things are brought about by staying true to how the Sharia functions and the intent of the lawgiver regarding how the Sharia is supposed to function. And Ibn Taymiyyah uses that argument all the time. This does not meet the usul of Sharia to go against the opinions of the form.
Thank you, Dr. Khater, for that clarificatory contribution. I think it's been nearly 3 hours, but I just want to give a couple of an opportunity for a couple of questions, if there are any. I know that we've now gone down to just a few number of participants, so I don't expect the Q&A will take, which has already started, will take more than a few more minutes. So any questions? David, please come in. Can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Hi there, how are you doing? It worked. My question was actually to Mahdi regarding his paper, which I thought was a really interesting idea. I was just wondering more about how, how he's basically going to engage with the madhab structure itself in terms of, he talked about precedent, right? So I was just wondering how would he be engaging that in terms of his proposed model? Because as we know, I mean, as we discussed yesterday, there's, the base text, the commentaries, the super commentaries on top of those, and, legal change happens incrementally throughout that whole, structure of the text. So I was just wondering how he'd be engaging with that, because that's how law works, through precedent, right? So I didn't really understand that part, because he spoke mostly about the God being central and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for your question. And I think your point is, kind of an extension of Dr. Anjum's point, where I need to be a little bit more precise about my engagement with the pre-modern kind of discourse. Is your question, are you basically implying that maybe when I write my paper, I need to, or it would be fruitful to look at it through the lens of one particular madhab instead of speaking more generally about Islamic law?
Not necessarily. It's more that just, I'm not a lawyer by training, unlike yourself, but I mean, as far as I understand, law works through precedent, and you go back to the nearest precedent unless there's a case that warrants going further back and so on. So I was just wondering how you would be engaging with that. I mean, even if you're going pre-colonial in terms of that, as well as more contemporary stuff in terms of looking at that idea of integrity and fairness and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would make sense as I develop this paper to narrow in on a particular madhab, for example, and look at how the discourse has shifted within that madhab instead of picking and choosing, and I think that may have been accidentally what I did a little bit in this paper, where I looked at maybe some of the reformists that are discussing things that I was finding objectionable. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A more detailed overview about the way that jurists have discussed something within a particular madhab with reference to particular text, that will definitely improve the paper. But yeah, that's something I need to continue working on. So I really appreciate that feedback.
Cool. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Sharīʿa, you're muted.
I'm sorry. We have a question in the chat by Julio Cesar. Jazakumullah khairan for anyone. So this is a question for all the participants, panelists. How can we connect Western academics in Maqāṣid al-Fiqh in special and in Islamic studies in general into Arabic universities like Medina and Azhar and scholars and mashayikh between brackets in the Middle East? I reside and study in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but making bridges between these worlds is not easy for me. So a very interesting question about the context in which we produce this kind of knowledge on Maqāṣid. Most of us, I think, most of the panelists are presenters from Western academic institutions. I hope I didn't get that wrong, but yeah. Please, anyone would like to start? Dr. Awaimer, would you like to come to that question? I don't see any takers.
Well, I think that Dr. Ahmed Khater, in fact, bridges these two worlds. He works with, he deals with giving fatwa and with the Majma body that issues fatwa in the United States. And that's actually one of the reasons why I thought having him was really amazing and fascinating. And I think that we noticed already in the discussion in his presentation that there is a differential attitude toward intellectual history, right? And I think that having this kind of discussion, having those shuyukh who are more traditionally trained and they function in Muslim communities giving fatwa and dealing with those complexities on the ground is the way to go. So for any of you, if you want to take that question, especially Sheikh Ahmed, please do so.
I guess I'll have to go. There definitely is a culture shock between the two. Often it's described as, Islamic universities in the Middle East study Islam, whereas in Western institutions they study about Islam. I always heard that. I found that not always be the case. I've also found scholars in Western academia who are even stronger than scholars in Islamic universities. So I think it is definitely a different outlook. And I think it's healthy to have both. I do believe that people discussing Maqāṣid or Usul al-Fiqh should have the Usuli background that is people are trained in the Middle East. So I've studied in both. So at UC Berkeley, for example, in the graduate program, when we did Usul al-Fiqh, it was much different than what we did in the Middle East. And like in UC Berkeley, we did, for example, they would give us certain sections from al-Mahsul of al-Razi and then al-Ihkam of al-Amidi. You would say, read this section and then jump and read another section. They didn't finish entire books. They didn't have a ladder of progression, starting with primers and ending with, advanced texts. But it was just kind of a survey of sections here and there. And then that led to, writing a paper. And so, whereas in the Middle East, this concept of study from the beginning to the end, finish entire texts, read entire encyclopedic works, and I think it forms different approaches towards looking at this. And I think the best way to do it is to combine between the critical analysis and the historical textual criticism that we're taught at in the Western Academy, but also doing so after having been properly trained by actually studying entire texts, as opposed to looking at certain sections here and there and then believing that makes you qualified to write in theology or Quranic studies or usul or whatever the case might be. And so I think that that would be the best way to bridge between the two, is to take the training. You're not going to study Al-Fiqh ibn Malik in Berkeley. But if you came already having studied Al-Fiqh ibn Malik, already memorized Jam' al-Jawami' and usul, you already finished, for example, Hidayah, if you're Hanafi in fiqh, and so on and so forth. You're qualified now to delve into these textual historical discussions and do that critical analysis. So I think one complements the other, and the strongest students and academics are those who combine between the two. So I think and at the same time, in the Middle East, sometimes we don't want to, coming back from a classical perspective, we have these givens that are khalas yani. We don't want to start questioning things, whereas it's in the Western Academy, nothing is off limits. And sometimes that's good, because if you're able to get through that questioning and, gold, when it goes through the fire, comes out pure after that test, then you're solid. And I think that is lacking in the Western world. In the Middle East, in the Muslim world, they don't have that type of. There is a revival kind of that starting to happen, but that wasn't always the case. You would come in, you would memorize what's been already established in the madhahib and already established in usul, and you don't really have to question anything because it's already a given. So I think if you combine between the two mindsets, you will be very strong.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khater and Dr. Uwaimer, for dealing with that fantastic question. I noticed David has his hand up. I wonder whether this is a legacy hand, or is this a new question, David?
Yeah, it's to respond to the question you just raised. I mean, even at a practical level, I'm dealing with works and texts and authors and things from Mauritania and the Sahara Desert. So trying to locate these things is quite difficult sometimes. So, I mean, actually, even just using social media and so forth, I've actually made contact with a number of historians working in the universities there, sons of well-known scholars and so on and so forth, who have actually helped me find some of the material I need to do my research and actually help clarify some aspects of that for me as well. So, I mean, even at a practical level, things like that are available, especially if you have some level of language ability in the target language. So, I mean, all of these type of options are available nowadays. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Thank you, David. I think the reliance of the Western Academy on insights and support from Islamic universities goes back a long time to the 19th century. So those bridges have been there, but it's the question of power. How much is the production of knowledge on Islam really constituted through a dialogue or a two-way, conversation? Which brings me to, if I don't want to close before asking that question, but nobody has to answer it. It's the question of power that Yusuf engaged with. Thank you, Yusuf, for engaging with that, because I raised it in the first panel. And this is more about, and linking it with what Dr. Uwaimer posited today about what kind of Islamic tradition, Islamic legal tradition do we want to maintain and keep? And I'm thinking here not of the theory, neither of the usul nor of the furu', but the structures through which the law was produced, which were exclusionary of women, or largely exclusionary of women. And so the elitism, the male elitism of the tradition is undeniable. How can we produce a model through which we can address this issue? It is very noticeable that the female participants in this symposium are few. We can't be blind to these facts. So how do we make an intervention that neither turns on the terms that are produced outside the tradition, feminism to be more precise, nor reproduce a structure or even a modern critical take on the discourse of the past that maintains these kinds of exclusionary practices? I realize this is a big question, maybe needs another symposium, maybe the next symposium should be on that. But thank you all so very much. And I will hand over to Dr. Uwaymir if anyone wants to come back on the gender question or on the women question, however you want to frame it. I'd be happy to listen now and maybe have a conversation afterwards. Dr. Uwaymir, over to you. Thank you so much for making me part of it. It's been an honor and a pleasure to listen to all of you and to contribute. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Sharīʿa, this is actually a really apt reminder of this really important question that we all face. You're absolutely right that the power question we have to deal with not only, of course, between the West and East or Islamic world and the Western world, but also within the Muslim world in our own past. The tradition was not one thing, and it wasn't one that we seek to, or in our view, we should romanticize and merely seek to reproduce. And I think that the question of gender that you raise is one of those that we ought really to pay attention to, but also other questions such as those of social status or even race that we haven't raised, but that were there. Those were elephants in the room that the jurists had to work with rather than confront. But I think that for our time, those questions need to be confronted much more directly. And for that, I think there is no better place to start than your forthcoming, what recently published editorial for the American Journal of Islam and Society, which I recommend each one of you to read our current issue that just came out this week, in which Dr. Sharīʿa Naguib has a really fascinating and really profound engagement with both feminism and what would it take to do an Islamic engagement with both feminism and the problem of gender inequality and inequities that are facts on the ground. So I think that my very strong vote is that our next symposium next year, inshallah, should be on that question, and we should start working on a call for papers for our next symposium. And I invite all of you to stay engaged with that as well. That's all I have to say. I think that your question is very timely. I do want to have just a few sort of housekeeping type things that you should remember. All of these papers are going to be considered for publication in American Journal of Islam and Society. Our hope is that each of those papers, each of your papers will make it. It will have to go through our usual double-blind review process, but we will do what we can to ensure that you have a really good chance at making that phase. If you do submit your paper within the timeline that we specified, and that those guidelines are still there on our website if you want to check. I think the deadline is sometime in June. Then you will have the contractual honorarium that we talked about there as well. But even if you cannot make it because your life is just, you have many other better things to do, we strongly suggest that you submit your paper when you can. And we were hoping that our next issue to be published in fall, and possibly even the one next spring, is going to be made up of many of these papers. Our hope is that our next special issue for this fall is going to be these papers. So those of you who have submitted and have done substantial amount of work already, Mehdi, you have, Yusuf, you have, Sami, and I think others as well. Those papers, of course, are close to being done, and we really strongly encourage that you submit them with this feedback as soon as possible, so that We do need some time for the, we have 2 blind reviewers, each of them have their own life, and especially in COVID era, everybody takes twice as long as they used to. So we're going to try to do our best to get them through in time. But if you submit your suggestions or your final draft sooner rather than later, that would make our job easier.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I think at this point we should close. It's been 3 hours and it's Ramadan, and I know some of you, for some of you, this is very awkward time, especially in Australia. So thank you, Davis, especially. I know you have to wake up
after
around
3 a.m. here.
Oh my God.
It's the hard time here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Everyone, to the organization again, and to all of you for participating. I enjoyed it very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was truly a pleasure.
It was. Thank you.
It was great meeting everyone. Hope to work with everyone again in the future. Thank you very much.
Inshallah.
Okay, then we close the day. استودعناكم الله, and inshallah you complete your Ramadan in a blessed way and have a very Eid Mubarak, inshallah. في أمان الله. السلام عليكم.
استودعكم الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
وعليكم السلام.